Hi everyone, I'm Jack Thremling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts on Master and Commander by Patrick O'Brian. This is my first voyage with Lucky Jack Aubrey and Dr. Stephen Maturin, and I did enjoy it. Though the reasons I enjoyed this book and the reasons that I look forward to reading Post-Captain and hopefully continuing with the full series sort of surprised me. I enjoyed historical fiction a lot when I was younger. I read it less and less now. I sort of just want to read nonfiction about history. But this is a series I remember seeing the spines in bookstores, that shelf of Patrick O'Brian books and the different colored spines that were always very pretty. And I remember when the Master and Commander of the Far Side of the World film came out when I was a teenager, and I watched that and enjoyed it, and I sort of recognized that it was based on a book, but I never felt the need to sit down and actually read the book. I was probably reading Lord of the Rings, to be honest, at that point. And so over the years, it's been about 20 years since that film came out, I've just never even really sat down and opened one of them. And I came across these at a charity sale. It was sort of the whole paperback series for $10, and I just picked it up. I thought, why not try it? Lots of folks praise it. And the reason a lot of folks praise this series is the friendship, the relationship between Aubrey and Maturin. That's the series is often referred to as the Aubrey-Maturin novels. And so I was curious to see that, curious to see how two people from sort of different backgrounds, different experiences, but both thrust into the conflict of the Napoleonic Wars at sea, what that experience would look like. I remember being a big reader of the Sharpe novels by Bernard Cornwell, and watching the Sharpe film series, or miniseries, with my father in the 1990s, and just really enjoying those, being into that. The Napoleonic period is something that I do find interesting. But for whatever reason, I think I know a main one, I just never gravitated towards these novels set at sea. And I think a good portion of that is probably due to the fact that I live in a desert. But these are good. And now, I'll be honest, the thing that I appreciated most about these books was not getting the sense of being at sea. I still don't really know what that feels like. And these books don't create that sense for me because I don't have anything to anchor that understanding to. I can read about it, I can empathize with what it would feel like to have the storm come or to be rocking constantly, sleeping in a hammock, the food, such that we may call it, that they eat on these voyages. But there are so many other senses that I just don't understand. But what I did appreciate was the dry sense of humor that Patrick O'Brian has. And he starts right with that, right off. So at the very beginning, we meet Aubrey and Maturin before they've met each other and they know each other's names at this little concert at Port Mahon. And so they're sitting there, and we're in the perspective of one character whose name we really don't know, and he's just enjoying this. The listener farther to the left was a man of between 20 and 30 whose big form overflowed his seat, leaving only a streak of gilt wood to be seen here and there. He was wearing his best uniform, the white lapelled blue coat, white waistcoat, breeches and stockings of a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, with the silver medal of the Nile in his buttonhole, and the deep white cuff of his gold-buttoned sleeve beat the time, while his bright blue eyes, staring what would have been a pink and white face if it had not been so deeply tanned, gazed fixedly at the bow of the first violin. The high note came, the pause, the resolution, and with the resolution the sailor's fist swept firmly down upon his knee. He leant back in his chair, extinguishing it entirely, sighed happily, and turned towards his neighbor with a smile. The words, "Very finely played, sir, I believe," were formed in his gullet, if not quite in his mouth, when he caught the cold, and indeed inimical, look and heard the whisper, "If you really must beat the measure, sir, let me entreat you to do so in time, and not half a beat ahead." Jack Aubrey's face instantly changed from friendly, ingenuous, communicative pleasure to an expression of somewhat baffled hostility. He could not but acknowledge that he had been beating the time, and although he had certainly done so with perfect accuracy, in itself the thing was wrong. His color mounted. He fixed his neighbor's pale eye for a moment, said, "I trust," and the opening notes of the slow movement cut him short. And so that's how we're introduced to Jack Aubrey, the captain, is that he's really getting into himself at the concert. And there's this humanizing quality to that aspect of the characterization in the books. So many characters are introduced. There's a wealth of characters introduced. And that is what I really enjoyed about this. It's a book that's peopled with characters, not unlike the books that George Eliot was writing in the 19th century, where there are so many different individuals. They're not just archetypes. They're not just pieces to be moved around on a chessboard. There really is this sense of like humans who have aspirations and who have come from somewhere and are going to some place, perhaps to a watery grave. But there is that sense of personality that is shaped in the characters. And Patrick O'Brian is very deft at that. But he's also just incredibly dry and droll in the way that he sort of pokes fun at specifically Aubrey throughout the book. And it's often through the phrasing or the mind of Dr. Maturin that we have these jokes. The fact that Aubrey sort of just overspills the chair. There are references to the fact that because he spends so much time at sea, and he has since he was a boy, he can't run on land. And so at one point they go to try and, get involved in some action to secretly attack a fort that's on land. And Aubrey's trying to, lead the assault because he's the leader. And it's sort of a shambles because the man can't run properly. And so there's those aspects of it. The idea that he sort of loses his head at times. That when we do get in Aubrey's mind, we see that O'Brian creates him as a character who's not all powerful, who's not this brilliant mastermind of naval tactics and being able to lie wait and catch the Spanish frigate, ships or the French ships and force them, to surrender. It's rather there's this sense of greed to him. We understand it. We know why. We know that he doesn't have the money that some of his peers and fellow officers, masters and commanders or captains within the Navy have. And so there's this desperation to him that really creates this three-dimensional character. And that was what I really got into. It was not so much the sense of life at sea. It wasn't even necessarily the sense of this theater of the Napoleonic Wars. I've read extensively about them. One of my very favorite games to play is Commands and Colors Napoleonics. I play it with our daughters, and we all love it. But that's not what drew me in. It really was the sense of humanity, this three-dimensional sense to Aubrey in particular, and the way that he's a character with clay feet that gets chipped at throughout the book. Thought that was interesting. The way that Maturin is constantly sort of our eyes and ears as individuals who are being introduced to this world. Because even for readers who have sailed, there is a sense that it's very different now in the 21st century, or was in the middle of the 20th century when the book was written, than it was in 1800. And so Maturin allows O'Brian to sort of give readers a tour of the ship, because Maturin gets a tour of the ship, to ask questions, to try and understand certain procedures and protocol. Why do they stand out, and why would someone be flogged? What is the justification for that according to the officers, and how do the men seem to react to it? And Maturin sort of has this in-between aspect. He's, in a sense, becoming a friend to Aubrey, though Aubrey still perhaps struggled to beat the time at the beginning. And yet he also is not quite of his station, and so he's an outsider. And that allows us as outsiders to learn to appreciate this world and go on these journeys across the Mediterranean Sea. And just have a sense of what this world is like and down sort of the coast of Africa. So I really enjoyed it. I did want to read a passage that focuses more on what it's like when there is some naval action at hand. Westward in this case meant almost directly to the Sophie's lee, and making sail meant spreading virtually everything she possessed: lower, topsail, and topgallant studding sails, royals of casques, and even bonnets, for the chase had been made out to be a fair-sized pole-acre, with lateens on her fore and mizzen and square sails on her mainmast, and therefore French or Spanish. Almost certainly a good prize if only she could be caught. This was the pole-acre's view, without a doubt, for she had been lying to, apparently fishing her storm-damaged mainmast, when they first came in sight of one another. But the Sophie had scarcely sheeted home her topgallants before the pole-acre's head was before the wind, and she was fleeing with all she could spread in that short notice. A very suspicious pole-acre, unwilling to be surprised. The Sophie, with her abundance of hands trained in setting sail briskly, ran 2 miles to the pole-acre's one in the first quarter of an hour. But once the chase had spread all the canvas it could, their speeds became more nearly even. With the wind 2 points on her quarter and her big square mainsail at its best advantage, the Sophie was still the faster, however, and when they had reached the greatest speed, she was running well over 7 knots to the pole-acre's 6. But they were running still 4 miles apart, and in 3 hours' time it would be pitch dark. No moon until 2:30. There was the hope, the very reasonable hope, that the chase would carry something away, for she had certainly had a rough night of it, and many a glass was trained upon her from the Sophie's forecastle. Jack stood there by the starboard knighthead, willing the sloop on with all his might, and feeling that his right arm might not be too great a price for an effective bow chaser. He stared back at the sails and how they drew, and he looked searchingly at the water rising in her bow wave and sliding fast along her smooth black side, and it appeared to him that with her present trim the after sails were pressing her forefoot down a trifle much, that the extreme press of canvas might be hindering her progress, and he bade them take in the main royal. Rarely had he given an order more reluctantly obeyed, but the log line proved that he was right. The Sophie ran a little easier, a very little faster, with the winds thrust more forward. And it goes on to continue this. Dimmer, dimmer, and then she was gone. Suddenly she was quite gone. The quadrant of horizon that had shown that faint but most interesting bobbing paleness was bare, heaving sea, with Regulus setting into it. Masthead, he hailed, what do you make of her? A long pause. Nothing, sir. She ain't there. Just so, what was he to do now? He wanted to think. He wanted to think there on deck in the closest possible touch with the situation, with the shifting wind on his face, the glow of the binnacles just at hand, and not the least interruption. And this the conventions and the discipline of the service allowed him to do. The blessed inviolability of a captain, so ludicrous at times, such a temptation to silly pomp, wrapped him about, and his mind could run free. And it goes on with this great chase scene that's gone on for several pages, and there is a denouement to that. But that is a sense of what the story feels like. There is a sense of adventure, a thrust. And there is this sense of calm and then action. And then calm and then action again. That O'Brien uses to pace the novel pretty well. He's gradually introducing more and more language, a better sense of what conflict at sea is like throughout the book. And we see the turns of fortune in very startling detail. So as I said, I enjoyed the book. And I'm interested in reading Post Captain. I'm interested in reading HMS Surprise, the Mauritius Command, and the others. We'll see how long it takes me to get to the next. I kind of want to read a few of these to just get a sense, again, of the language, the vocabulary, the jargon, and also a sense of the characters, how O'Brien chose to develop them as he was publishing these early novels in the 1970s. And then perhaps space it out to enjoy growing with the characters, as I know some folks like Brian over at Bookish have, or Mark at Book Time with Elvis. So yeah, I'll look forward to this. The other feature that I thought was interesting was the character of Dylan, an officer who we find out has some Irish heritage, that Dr. Maturin has some Irish heritage, and the way that they each perceive being part of the Navy, even as there is discontent, justified discontent with how the British have been ruling Ireland, have been overlords of Ireland, and what that has looked like, what their individual sense of identity and the private nationalism or rebellions that they nurse are interesting. So, as I said, I'll look forward to reading more. And again, the humor, O'Brien's sense of humor was what I enjoyed most. Now, of course, I'll be looking forward to Post Captain. One of the things I thought that seemed very appropriate is that these novels are set somewhat contemporaneously to the Regency period that Jane Austen writes and set her novels within. And there is this sense of the dialogue sort of mirroring some of the way Austen's characters speak. There is a different sensibility, perhaps, but the times when we are in port, or the times where we see characters who are of different stations, having some sense. One thing I think that's different is that Austen has characters who are often middle class or have sort of fallen from the middle class, but have a sense of being able to have once associated with individuals who are a little bit wealthier and have that station. With Master and Commander, O'Brien really does give us a broad sense of individuals who are, children of wealthy parents trying to be, find a way in the Navy. Individuals who have had an education or who the sea is their education. Individuals who are not even English and have no sense of ever desiring to be English. But the way that the dialogue flows, the sensibilities of the characters are similar in a number of respects. And the droll humor is very present in both. Another book that I think I was reminded of for different reasons was Herman Melville's Moby Dick, in part because the detail around whaling that Melville gives us is very present. This is not a book about whaling, it's a book about so much more, but we learn a lot about whaling within this book. Just as in Victor Hugo's Les Miserables, we learn a lot about sewers, even though it's not a book about the sewers of Paris. And O'Brien pulls in aspects of that. We learn a lot about naval ships, even though the book is really about these human relationships and their aspirations. So that was one I thought of. Another book that I've been reading and thinking about the contrast is how Camus in the Lusiads explores sort of from a poetic perspective and from an epic perspective the sense of discovery and navigation and the violence and horrors that come with that from a much more panegyric, hagiographic point of view. Something that's very different, I think, from what O'Brien was doing. He's willing to let his characters be human and to make mistakes and to fail at times. And that's not necessarily something we would see in a work like the Lusiads, magnificent as it is. And the sense of adventure, the sense of friendship, reminded me of a book that I've read a couple of times since I was a child, The Three Musketeers by Alexandre Dumas, and the successor novels, 20 years later, the very long book that ends with The Man in the Iron Mask, those works. But I was also thinking of three writers who were writing about aspects of the British Empire in the 20th century, or from the point of view of someone who is living in Britain in the middle of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, and seeing how the world is changing and what British identity means in that world. And so one writer I thought of was John le Carré, and sort of trying to understand what does the conflict of the Cold War look like compared to the conflict of the Napoleonic Wars. What does it mean to have betrayal, to have a sense of passion, but a quiet passion perhaps. And so this was one that I was thinking about, how le Carré drops us into that spy world and has the lingo of honey trap and the scalp hunters, things like that they let us have this sensibility, made up as it was, of what his spycraft looked like. From a very different perspective, we have Ian Fleming, who sort of almost has this character who's not experiencing the realities of the second half of the 20th century, but is rather experiencing this sense of adventure that is really no longer available to people. And that his secret agent is someone who feels more closely aligned to Jack Aubrey, and that sense of like, well, you thrust yourself in, you're tough, you make these choices, as opposed to rubbing shoulders with George Smiley in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. And then finally, I think writing really contemporary writer with Patrick O'Brian was George MacDonald Fraser with the Flashman books. And these are set a couple of generations after Master and Commander and the Aubrey-Maturin novels. But the sense of how does one view the 18th and 19th centuries and the conflicts the British were involved in from the lens of the second half of the 20th century. And O'Brien and Bernard Cornwell sort of are in one vein where they're trying to create these human three-dimensional characters, but there is a real sense of heroism. Whereas George MacDonald Fraser, the characters can behave with courage, but they're absolute scoundrels. They're greedy, venal, and we see a different side of the coin, a perspective that the distance of time really gives us a very different sense and flavor. So that was something I thought of as well. But again, I enjoyed Master and Commander. I'm looking forward to Post Captain. Hope everyone's doing well.